There's a moment almost everyone who has lived through a real winter knows by heart. It is 5 in the morning, the heater clicks on somewhere in the wall, and you lie there listening to it groan to life while your breath is still visible in the dark room. You think about how much that little click is going to cost you this month. You think about the draft under the door, the cold tile floor waiting for your feet, the layers you will need just to walk to the kitchen. Maybe you grew up in an old house where one room was always warm and every other room felt like punishment. Maybe you are an adult now opening a heating bill that makes your stomach drop, wondering if you should just put on another sweater instead of touching the thermostat. That fear of the cold, that quiet dread of winter mornings, is older than any of us. It is older than electricity, older than gas lines, older than insulated walls. For most of human history, winter simply killed people in large numbers every single year, and almost nobody questioned it because nobody had ever known anything else. What changed that? What finally gave ordinary people a fighting chance against the season that used to bury entire villages in silence, began with one man, one very specific and almost boring professional problem, and one freezing city at the edge of an empire. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why your radiator looks the way it does, why entire wars were eventually fought over the fuel that keeps it running, and why the very invention that saved millions of lives from the cold is now quietly involved in warming the whole planet in a way nobody intended. To understand how strange and dangerous winter used to be, you have to forget everything you know about a modern home. Picture a city like St. Petersburg in the early 1800s, with its wide frozen rivers and its wind that comes straight off the Baltic Sea with nothing to stop it. Houses were heated, if you can call it that, by open fireplaces or by large masonry stoves that took hours to warm up and only heated the room they were built into. If you wanted heat in another room, you needed another fire, another stack of wood, another servant or family member tending it through the night. Most ordinary homes had one warm room and several cold ones, and people simply accepted that the bedroom would be cold, that water left in a basin overnight would have a layer of ice on it by morning, that getting dressed in winter meant doing it as fast as humanly possible. In poorer homes, an entire family might sleep crowded together in the one room with the stove, partly for warmth and partly because there was nowhere else worth being. Hospitals, schools, and factories were no better. Patients in winter wards were sometimes found with frost on their blankets. Workers in textile mills and metal shops lost fingers and toes to frostbite while standing at machines in rooms that were never properly heated, because heating an entire industrial building with open fires was either impossible or so expensive that owners simply did not bother. The death toll from this was not small or symbolic. Across Europe, Russia, and North America, winter mortality spiked every single year, and it was not just the elderly or the sick who died. Healthy adults died from hypothermia walking home from work. Infants died in unheated nurseries. Entire rural communities sometimes lost 10% of their population in a single brutal winter, especially when a cold season combined with poor harvests and fuel shortages. People did not call this a crisis because it was simply the background noise of being alive before a certain point in history. Doctors of the time wrote about something called winter sickness, a vague category covering everything from pneumonia to circulatory failure brought on by prolonged cold exposure, and it was treated as an unavoidable seasonal tax on the human body. If you had told someone in 1840 that within their grandchildren's lifetime, ordinary working families would have warm air or warm water running invisibly through pipes in every room of their home, they would have looked at you as though you were describing magic. This is exactly the world that a man named Franz Sangalli was living and working in the 1850s. Sangalli was not a scientist chasing a grand theory of physics. He was a businessman born in Germany in 1824, who had moved to Russia as a young man and built a career manufacturing decorative cast iron and metal goods in St. Petersburg. He ran factories. He understood heat in the very practical sense of a man who has to keep machinery, workshops, and eventually his own greenhouses, functioning through a Russian winter that could easily drop far below freezing for months at a time. His problem was specific and almost mundane. He needed a way to heat enclosed spaces, including his own conservatories, where he grew plants that simply could not survive the cold, without relying on dangerous open fires inside delicate structures, and without needing someone to constantly feed and monitor a stove. He wanted heat that was steady, even, and did not require a flame in the same room as the thing being warmed. Sangalli experimented with hot water and steam moving through enclosed metal systems, an idea that had been floating around engineering circles in a primitive form for decades, used mostly in industrial settings and a handful of wealthy estates. What he did differently, around 1855, was design and build a practical cast iron device made of hollow sections that water could flow through, sections that could be connected in a row to increase surface area, allowing hot water from a central source to circulate through them and release heat steadily into a room. He called it, in essence, a heating body, and the device would eventually become known across the world as the radiator. It was not a sudden flash of genius from nowhere. It came from years of frustration with smoky stoves, ruined plants, workers who could not function in cold workshops, and the slow process of trial, failure, and adjustment that defines almost every real invention rather than the myth of the lightning bolt idea. Sangalli patented his design and began producing and installing these heating systems, first in his own buildings and greenhouses, then for clients who saw what he had built and wanted the same warmth without the smoke, soot, and danger of open flame. Before you keep going, if you are someone who has ever sat in a cold apartment doing math in your head about whether you can afford to turn the heat up, or if winter has ever felt like something you have to survive rather than just live through, I just want to say that this channel exists for people exactly like you. I am not here to sell you anything or rush you into anything. I just genuinely enjoy digging up these stories about the small, almost invisible decisions that quietly reshaped how regular people live, especially the ones that touch something as basic as staying warm and staying alive through a hard season. If that kind of story makes you feel a little less alone in your own daily struggles, or just satisfies that itch of wanting to understand why the world works the way it does, sticking around and subscribing means you will keep getting more of these with me, and honestly, that means a lot. There is no pressure, just an open door if you want to keep learning alongside people who get it. What Sangalli had built inside his own factories in St. Petersburg did not stay contained to one businessman's greenhouses for long. Within the surrounding industry, his cast iron heating bodies sparked a small but immediate wave of interest among other manufacturers, engineers, and builders who recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Iron foundries that had previously poured metal mostly for decorative railings, stoves, and machine parts began retooling to produce radiator sections at scale. Plumbing and metalworking trades, which had existed mostly to serve wealthy estates with elaborate single installations, suddenly had a genuine mass market product to sell. Something that could be manufactured in standard sizes, shipped, and installed by trained workers rather than custom, built by a single craftsman for a single client. This sounds like a small industrial shift, but it created an entirely new specialized trade almost overnight: the heating engineer, a profession that simply had not existed in any organized form before. Within a couple of decades, cities across Russia and then into Germany, France, Britain, and the United States had companies whose entire business was designing, manufacturing, and installing these radiator-based heating systems in buildings that had never had anything beyond fireplaces and stoves. The social impact that followed was even larger, because heat is not just a comfort, it is a precondition for how densely and how safely people can live together. Before central heating spread, multi-story apartment buildings were genuinely difficult to heat evenly, since fireplaces and stoves on different floors competed for chimney space and created real fire risk when every single unit needed its own open flame. With centralized boiler systems feeding radiators throughout a building, architects and developers could suddenly design taller, denser apartment blocks with confidence that every unit, not just the ones near a working fireplace, could be kept livable through winter. This mattered enormously for the rapid urbanization happening across Europe and North America in the late 1800s, as millions of rural workers moved into cities seeking factory jobs. Cities like New York, Chicago, Berlin, and London were absorbing population at a staggering rate, and central heating became one of the quiet, enabling technologies that made it possible to stack human beings safely on top of each other in tenements and apartment buildings, without every single floor needing its own dangerous fire source. Health outcomes shifted as a direct result. Respiratory illness linked to smoke inhalation from individual room fires declined in buildings that switched to centrally heated steam or hot water systems, since the combustion now happened in one contained boiler rather than in dozens of separate fireplaces, filling rooms with smoke. Infant mortality in winter months, tracked by city health departments in places like New York by the early 20th century, showed measurable improvement in buildings equipped with proper heating compared to those still relying on individual stoves. There was also a quieter shift in daily habits and social class that is easy to overlook. For centuries, the ability to stay warm through winter had been a fairly direct marker of wealth, since only the rich could afford enough fuel, enough servants to tend fires constantly, and homes large enough to have a warm room to retreat to. As radiator-based heating systems became cheaper to manufacture and install, and as fuel delivery infrastructure for coal and later gas expanded into working-class neighborhoods, warmth slowly stopped being an exclusively upper-class privilege. This did not happen evenly or quickly, and poorer families in many cities continued to suffer through cold winters well into the 20th century, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Reform movements focused on tenement housing conditions in cities like New York explicitly began including heating requirements in their demands, arguing that adequate winter warmth was a basic right tied to public health rather than a luxury. By the early 1900s, building codes in major cities began legally requiring landlords to provide minimum heating temperatures during winter months, a regulatory shift that simply could not have happened before a practical, scalable heating technology existed to make compliance possible. From there, the consequences moved into territory that touched governments, economies, and entire industries in ways that Sam Galli, sitting in his St. Petersburg workshop in 1855, could never have imagined. The widespread adoption of central heating created enormous new demand for fuel, first coal, and later, as systems evolved, oil and natural gas. Coal mining regions in places like Pennsylvania, Wales, and the Ruhr Valley in Germany experienced significant economic growth, partly driven by this new category of demand, since heating buildings through long winters required steady, massive fuel supply chains that simply had not existed at that scale before. Entire local economies grew up around coal extraction, transport, and delivery, specifically tied to residential and commercial heating needs, separate from the coal demand of industrial machinery and railways that already existed. Labor movements among coal miners gained real political leverage precisely because so much of urban civilization had become dependent on a steady fuel supply for heat, meaning a miner's strike in winter could threaten to leave entire cities cold, a kind of pressure point that simply did not exist when every household tended its own small individual fire with locally gathered wood. This dependency only deepened in the 20th century as heating systems shifted from coal furnaces toward oil and natural gas, and it eventually became one of the threads tying ordinary domestic comfort directly into international politics and war. The oil shocks of the 1970s, when major oil-producing nations restricted exports and prices spiked dramatically, hit home heating costs across Europe and North America with brutal force, forcing governments to ration fuel, encourage citizens to lower thermostats, and rethink national energy policy almost overnight. Decades later, when conflicts disrupted natural gas pipelines running from Russia into Europe, The consequences were not abstract geopolitical headlines. They were millions of households facing the very real possibility of cold winters, because the fuel that fed their heating systems was tied to international politics far beyond their control. It is a strange thread to follow back, but it runs in an unbroken line from a St. Petersburg businessman trying to keep his greenhouse plants alive to entire national governments negotiating energy security as a matter of survival and sovereignty. The story does not stop at coal mines and oil politics, because the scale eventually became global and civilizational. As centrally heated buildings became the global standard across wealthy and middle-income nations through the 20th century, the demand for fuel to feed boilers and furnaces became one of the significant ongoing contributors to global carbon emissions, alongside transportation and industrial production. Heating buildings, which sounds like such a small, local, personal act, became one of the structural pillars of global energy consumption, responsible for a substantial share of total emissions in countries with cold climates, where months of continuous heating are simply a fact of life rather than an occasional convenience. The very systems that saved millions of human lives from hypothermia, frostbite, and winter-related illness became, decades later, part of a feedback loop contributing to a warming planet, which is now producing its own dangerous extremes, just in the opposite direction, with deadly heat waves replacing some of the deadly winters that radiators once solved. This is the genuinely strange and almost poetic irony sitting at the center of this entire story. Central heating did exactly what it was supposed to do. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most significant life-saving technologies in modern history, quietly responsible for sparing an almost uncountable number of people from a slow, miserable death by cold that used to be considered an ordinary part of the seasonal calendar. Public health researchers studying winter mortality across the 20th century have consistently found that improved indoor heating, alongside better insulation and building standards, was one of the largest single factors in the dramatic decline of cold-related deaths in developed nations. Yet the fuel burned to make that warmth possible at a civilizational scale has become deeply entangled with the climate crisis now reshaping the planet, creating new forms of seasonal danger that are, in their own way, just as serious as the old ones, just distributed differently across heat waves, droughts, and unstable weather patterns rather than frozen villages. The same basic human need, the need to control temperature and protect the body from an environment that can otherwise kill it, has simply moved its danger from one direction to another, and humanity is now racing to solve heating and cooling all over again, this time with heat pumps, renewable electricity, and building designs aimed at using a fraction of the energy that traditional radiator systems require. And yet none of this erases what that original invention meant to the people who lived through the shift. For someone living in a cold tenement apartment in 1890, the arrival of a working radiator in their building was not an abstract policy discussion about energy or emissions. It was the difference between a child sleeping safely through the night and a child waking up sick, or worse, not waking up at all. It was the difference between dreading winter as a season of survival and simply living through it as a season like any other. That shift in daily human experience, multiplied across millions of households over more than a century, is almost impossible to overstate, even with everything we now understand about the environmental cost that eventually came attached to it. Today, walk into almost any apartment, office, school, or hospital in a cold climate anywhere in the world, and you will find some descendant of that original idea quietly working behind the walls, whether it is an old-fashioned cast iron radiator, a modern forced air furnace, underfloor heating, or an electric heat pump. The basic principle Sangalé landed on in his St. Petersburg workshop, moving heated water or air through a system to warm a space evenly without an open flame in the room, remains the backbone of how the modern world stays warm. Engineers have refined the materials, the efficiency, the controls, and the fuel sources again and again. But the conceptual leap, the idea that heat could be generated centrally and distributed invisibly through pipes, rather than tended room by room with fire, traces directly back to that one cast iron device built to save some plants from a Russian winter. So picture him again, Franz Sangali, in 1855, standing in a cold St. Petersburg workshop, fitting together hollow iron sections, running hot water through them, watching warmth spread evenly into a space that had no fire in it at all. He was not thinking about apartment buildings in New York, or coal strikes in Pennsylvania, or oil politics in the 1970s, or a warming planet a century and a half later. He was thinking about plants, about machinery, about a very specific, very local, very small problem in front of him. And from that one small solution to one small problem, an entire invisible infrastructure grew. One that ended up deciding whether millions of people would live or die through winters that used to simply take them without warning. It is a strange thing to sit in a warm room today and realize that the quiet hum of your own heating system carries the fingerprint of a man solving a problem in a greenhouse almost 2 centuries ago. Proof that the smallest, most practical decisions are sometimes the ones that end up reshaping the whole world.